crisp autumn air as a convoy of police cars pulled up to the marble steps of Montgomery Estate. Detective Sarah Chen stepped out, clutching a manila envelope that would change everything. Inside the mansion, 72-year-old Richard Montgomery stood frozen at his study window, watching officers march toward his front door. His hands trembled as he recognized the young man walking beside the detective, a man he thought he'd never see again, the son he'd left to die in Blackwood Forest 23 years ago. Papers scattered across his mahogany desk as his lawyer frantically shuffled through documents, but it was too late. The DNA results were undeniable, the will was legitimate, and justice had finally found Richard Montgomery. You won't believe what happened when a father's cruelest betrayal came back to haunt him in the most unexpected way. 23 years earlier, on a rain-soaked October morning in 1999, 32-year-old Margaret Montgomery held her 8-year-old son David's hand as they waited in Dr. Patricia Reeves's office. Margaret's auburn hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and despite the worry lines that had deepened over the past year, her green eyes still sparkled with the fierce love only a mother could possess. David sat beside her, his dark hair perfectly combed by his mother's careful hands, his eyes focused intensely on the geometric patterns of the office carpet. He rocked slightly back and forth, a self-soothing motion that Margaret had learned not to interrupt. "Mrs. Montgomery, Doctor," Reeves began, her voice gentle but professional. "The comprehensive evaluation confirms what we've suspected. David has autism spectrum disorder. He's highly intelligent, but he'll need specialized support and understanding." Margaret squeezed her son's hand. "What does this mean for his future?" "With the right intervention, therapy, and most importantly, a loving, supportive environment, David can thrive. Many children with autism lead fulfilling, successful lives." David looked up at his mother, his voice clear and precise. "Mom, does this mean I'm broken?" Margaret's heart shattered. She knelt beside his chair, cupping his face in her hands. "Oh, sweetheart, you're not broken. You're perfectly you, and that's exactly who you're supposed to be." But when they returned home to their sprawling estate in Beverly Hills, Richard Montgomery's reaction was anything but supportive. Standing in his mahogany-paneled study, surrounded by oil paintings of his successful ancestors, Richard loosened his silk tie and poured himself a double scotch. His steel-gray eyes hardened as Margaret explained the diagnosis. "Autism," he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "Do you know what this means for my reputation? For the Montgomery name?" "Richard, he's our son," Margaret pleaded, her voice breaking. "He's damaged goods, Margaret." "What will the country club think? The board of directors? I'm up for partnership at Morrison & Associates, and I can't have people thinking there's something wrong with our family." Margaret's sister Catherine, who had driven them to the appointment, stood in the doorway listening to this exchange. Catherine worked as a nurse at Children's Hospital and had seen firsthand how loving families could help special needs children flourish. Her brown eyes filled with tears of anger as she heard Richard's callous words. "You're talking about your son, Richard," Catherine interjected. "David is a beautiful, intelligent child who just needs understanding." Richard whirled around. "Stay out of this, Catherine. This is between me and my wife." Over the following months, Margaret threw herself into helping David. She hired the best therapists, researched every intervention, and created a structured, loving environment where David could grow. The little boy began to blossom under his mother's care, his special interests in mathematics and astronomy revealing a brilliant mind. But Richard grew more distant and resentful with each passing day. David's teacher, Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, called Margaret one afternoon in December. "Mrs. Montgomery, I wanted to let you know that David solved a calculus problem today that most high school students would struggle with. He truly has a gift." Margaret beamed with pride, but when she shared the news with Richard that evening, he barely looked up from his Wall Street Journal. "Great," he muttered sarcastically. "Maybe he can calculate how much money I'm losing by not making partner because of him." The breaking point came on a snowy February morning in 2000. Margaret had been battling pneumonia for weeks, but she pushed through her illness to maintain David's routine. She collapsed while making his breakfast, and paramedic James Mitchell found her unconscious in the kitchen, with 9-year-old David sitting beside her, holding her hand and reciting prime numbers to stay calm. At Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, Dr. Amanda Foster delivered the devastating news. "Mrs. Montgomery, the pneumonia has developed into sepsis. Her immune system is severely compromised." Richard stood in the sterile hospital hallway, but his thoughts weren't on his dying wife or his son who needed him. He was calculating how this tragedy might actually solve his problems. Margaret died 3 days later, her last words a whispered plea to Richard. "Promise me you'll take care of David. Promise me you'll love him." Richard nodded, but his fingers were crossed behind his back. The funeral was held on a gray February morning at Forest Lawn Cemetery. David, dressed in a small black suit his mother had bought him for Christmas concerts, stood perfectly still as mourners filed past Margaret's casket. He didn't cry or make a sound, processing his grief in his own way. Aunt Catherine held his hand, her own face streaked with tears. "I know this is hard to understand, David," she whispered, "but your mama loved you more than all the stars in the sky." 100 billion stars in our galaxy, David replied quietly. "That's a lot of love." After the service, as guests shared stories of Margaret's kindness and devotion to her son, Richard made small talk with business associates. Judge Harold Whitman, a family friend and Margaret's godfather, approached David with gentle eyes. "Young man, your mother was very special. She loved you very much." David looked up at the elderly judge. "Judge Whitman, will someone still love me now that Mom is gone?" Harold's heart broke, and he glanced meaningfully at Richard, who was laughing loudly at someone's joke across the room. 3 days after the funeral, Richard's plan began to take shape. He told Catherine that David was staying with a friend for the weekend, then drove his son to Blackwood Forest, 30 miles north of the city. The dense woods were known for their hiking trails, but in February, they were largely deserted. "Where are we going, Dad?" David asked from the back seat, clutching his favorite astronomy book. "Just for a little walk, son. Your mother loved nature." Richard parked at an unmarked trailhead and led David deep into the forest. After walking for nearly an hour, when they were miles from any road or help, Richard stopped. "David, I want you to wait here while I go get something from the car." "How long should I wait?" "Just wait," Richard said, his voice cold. "And don't move from this spot." David nodded obediently, sitting on a fallen log with his book. Richard walked away, his footsteps growing fainter until they disappeared entirely. David waited as the sun began to set, as the temperature dropped, as darkness fell. He waited because his father had told him to wait, but someone else had been watching from the shadows. Frank Morrison, a 68-year-old retired forest ranger, had been tracking illegal dumping in these woods for months. He'd seen Richard's Mercedes pull up and had quietly followed them, something about the man's furtive behavior setting off alarm bells in his experienced mind. Frank had spent 40 years protecting these forests and the creatures in them, and he had an instinct for danger. When Frank saw Richard abandon the child and drive away, his weathered hands clenched into fists. He'd seen a lot in his time as a ranger, but this was beyond cruelty. Frank waited until Richard's taillights disappeared, then approached the confused boy. "Hey there, son," Frank called softly, not wanting to startle him. "What are you doing out here all alone?" David looked up, his young face pale in the moonlight. "My dad told me to wait here. He went to get something from the car." Frank knelt beside the boy, his heart aching. "How long ago was that?" David checked his digital watch, a gift from his mother. 4 hours and 17 minutes. What would you do if you found a child abandoned in the woods like this? Tell us in the comments below. Frank Morrison had been many things in his long life: a Marine, a forest ranger, a husband, a father. But he'd never been more certain of anything than he was in that moment. This child needed him, and he wasn't going to let him down the way his own father clearly had. Well, David, that is your name, isn't it? I think your dad might have gotten lost. Why don't you come with me and we'll figure this out? David hesitated. Mom always said never to go with strangers. Your mom sounds like a smart woman. My name is Frank Morrison. I used to be the ranger for these woods. What was your mom's name? Margaret Montgomery. She died 5 days ago. Frank's expression darkened as pieces of the puzzle fell into place. He'd read about the Montgomery funeral in the local papers, had seen the photos of the grieving husband and his autistic son. Now he understood exactly what Richard Montgomery had been trying to do. Frank took David to his small cabin on the edge of the forest, where he called his daughter-in-law, Dr. Lisa Morrison, a pediatrician who specialized in developmental disabilities. Lisa arrived within an hour, bringing warm clothes and a thermos of hot chocolate. David, Lisa said gently, can you tell me about your dad bringing you to the forest? David recounted the events with the precise detail typical of his autism. Lisa and Frank exchanged meaningful glances. This wasn't an accident or a misunderstanding. This was attempted murder. Over the following days, Frank and Lisa discovered that Richard had already reported David as a runaway. He'd told police that his son had become increasingly unstable since his mother's death and had vanished from their home. Missing person flyers with David's photo were posted around Beverly Hills, showing a concerned father desperately searching for his troubled child. But Frank had spent decades tracking creatures through the wilderness, and he knew how to stay hidden when necessary. He also knew that without concrete proof of Richard's intentions, a wealthy, respected businessman's word would carry more weight than a retired ranger's suspicions. We need evidence, Frank told Lisa, as David slept peacefully in the guest room. Something that proves what really happened. Lisa was reviewing David's medical records that Catherine had provided. She'd been frantically searching for her nephew since Richard reported him missing. Frank, look at this. David's autism isn't severe. With proper support, he could live independently, maybe even excel academically. Why would Richard? Because he sees the boy as damaged goods, an embarrassment. They made a difficult decision. Frank would keep David safe and hidden while they gathered evidence to expose Richard's crime. Lisa used her medical connections to ensure David continued his therapy sessions in secret, while Catherine, who suspected Richard was lying about David running away, quietly supported their efforts. Meanwhile, Richard was playing the grieving widower and desperate father to perfection. He appeared on local news programs, his eyes red-rimmed with crocodile tears. My son David is autistic and has been struggling since his mother's death. If anyone has seen him, please contact the police immediately. I just want my boy home safe. Judge Harold Whitman, Margaret's godfather, visited Richard frequently during this time. Something about the man's behavior didn't sit right with the experienced jurist. Richard seemed too composed, too rehearsed for a father whose child was missing. Richard, I've been thinking about Margaret's will, Harold mentioned during one visit. She left everything to David, with you as trustee until he turns 25. Have you contacted the attorneys about updating anything given his situation? Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I don't think that's appropriate to discuss right now, Harold. Can you guess what Harold is really thinking? Drop your predictions below. For 3 years, David lived in Frank's cabin, homeschooled by Lisa and visiting therapists who worked under assumed names. The boy flourished in the peaceful forest environment, his mathematical genius becoming even more pronounced. Frank taught him about nature, tracking, and survival skills, while Lisa ensured he received proper medical care and therapy. David never forgot his father's abandonment, but he also never lost his mother's loving voice in his memory. Frank and Lisa became his surrogate family, giving him the stability and acceptance his father had refused to provide. During this time, Catherine never stopped investigating David's disappearance. She hired private investigator Maria Santos, a former police detective who specialized in missing persons cases. Maria had a reputation for tenacity and an intuitive understanding of family dynamics. Mrs. Bennett, Maria told Catherine during one of their meetings. "I've reviewed the timeline of David's disappearance. Your brother-in-law's story has inconsistencies." Catherine leaned forward. "What kind of inconsistencies?" "He claims David disappeared from his bedroom sometime after midnight, but the security system shows no interior movement after 9 p.m. Either David vanished into thin air or Richard is lying." Maria's investigation led her to interview Richard's household staff, including Consuela Valdez, the housekeeper who had worked for the Montgomery family for 15 years. Consuela had loved Margaret and David dearly, and she'd been suspicious of Richard's story from the beginning. "Miss Santos," Consuela whispered during a clandestine meeting at a coffee shop, "Mr. Montgomery, he cleaned out David's room the day after reporting him missing. He donated all the boys' clothes, his toys, his books. What father does that when he's hoping his child will come home?" This revelation prompted Maria to dig deeper into Richard's financial records. What she discovered was stunning. Richard had been stealing from David's trust fund, the inheritance Margaret had left for her son. He'd been using the money to fund his lavish lifestyle and bad investments. "Catherine," Maria reported, "your brother-in-law has embezzled nearly $2 million from David's trust. If David ever returns, Richard would face prison time." Meanwhile, Frank was teaching David advanced survival and tracking skills. The boy's autism made him exceptionally good at pattern recognition and attention to detail, skills that served him well in the forest. By age 12, David could track animals through the underbrush, identify edible plants, and navigate by the stars his mother had taught him to love. "Frank," David said one evening as they sat by the campfire, "I understand now why my father left me here." Frank's weathered face showed concern. "What do you mean, son?" "He didn't want me because I'm different." "But being different isn't bad, is it? You and Lisa like that, I'm different." Frank put his arm around the boy. "David, being different is what makes you special. Your father's the one who's broken, not you." As David grew older, his mathematical abilities became extraordinary. He was solving complex equations that college professors would struggle with, and his understanding of astronomy rivaled that of graduate students. Dr. Lisa Morrison documented all of his progress, building a comprehensive file that would one day prove his competency. During his teenage years, David expressed a desire to understand his legal situation. Frank contacted Judge Harold Whitman through intermediaries, and the judge, who had never stopped questioning David's disappearance, agreed to secret meetings. "Your Honor," 16-year-old David said during their first face-to-face meeting since the funeral, "I remember everything about the day my father left me in the forest. I need to know what my legal options are." Judge Whitman was astonished by the articulate, intelligent young man before him. This wasn't the severely disturbed boy Richard had described to the police. This was a brilliant, thoughtful person who had been criminally wronged. "David, do you have any proof of what happened that day?" David reached into his backpack and pulled out his mother's astronomy book, the same one he'd been carrying in the forest 8 years earlier. "I've kept a detailed journal since that day, writing down everything I remember. Frank taught me that evidence is important." Over several months, Judge Whitman worked secretly with Frank, Lisa, Catherine, and Maria Santos to build an airtight case against Richard. They gathered financial records showing the embezzlement, testimony from witnesses who had seen Richard's callous behavior, and most importantly, David's own compelling account of his abandonment. The plan was intricate and would require perfect timing. They needed to expose Richard publicly in a way that would prevent him from escaping justice or fabricating another story. But then something incredible happened that would change everything. Richard Montgomery, now 55 years old and completely convinced that his problem had been permanently solved, received an unexpected visitor on a cold December morning in 2011. He was in his study, reviewing stock portfolios and planning a Christmas vacation to the Bahamas when his housekeeper Consuela knocked on the door. "Mr. Montgomery, there's someone here to see you. He says it's about David." Richard's blood ran cold, but he composed himself. "Send him in." The man who entered his study was tall and distinguished, wearing an expensive suit and carrying a leather briefcase. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his piercing blue eyes held an intelligence that made Richard uncomfortable. "Mr. Montgomery, my name is Attorney Jonathan Pierce. I represent your son David." Richard laughed, but it sounded forced. "That's impossible. My son disappeared 12 years ago. He's probably dead." Pierce smiled coldly. "Oh, he's very much alive, and he's retained my services regarding several matters. The first being the systematic embezzlement of his trust fund." Richard's face went white. "I don't know what you're talking about." Pierce opened his briefcase and laid out financial documents on Richard's desk. $2.7 million to be exact. Money that belonged to David, spent on your gambling debts, your failed business ventures, and your rather expensive lifestyle. "You can't prove anything," Richard stammered. "Actually, we can. We also have evidence regarding the attempted murder of David Montgomery on February 15th, 2000, in Blackwood Forest." Richard's legs gave out, and he sank into his leather chair. "Attempted murder? That's ridiculous." David ran away. Pierce leaned forward. "Mr. Montgomery, we have witnesses, documentation, and most damning of all, we have David himself. He's been waiting 12 years to tell his story, and he remembers every detail of that day." Pierce stood and walked to the window, looking out at the meticulously maintained gardens that David's stolen money had helped maintain. David is now 23 years old, a mathematical prodigy with 3 college degrees and a photographic memory. He's also about to inherit his mother's entire estate, since the trust fund stipulates that full control transfers to him on his 25th birthday. Richard's mind raced. If David was alive and could prove the embezzlement, Richard would lose everything: his reputation, his freedom, his fortune. "What do you want?" Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Pierce smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Justice, Mr. Montgomery. Complete and total justice." The next few days passed in a haze of terror for Richard. He tried to contact his lawyers, but Pierce had already shared the evidence with the district attorney's office. He considered fleeing the country, but discovered that his passport had been flagged and his assets were frozen pending investigation. On December 20th, 2011, exactly 12 years and 10 months after he'd abandoned his son in the forest, Richard received a knock on his door. This time it wasn't a lawyer. Standing on his doorstep was a young man with dark hair and intelligent eyes, wearing a simple sweater and jeans. Beside him stood an elderly man with weathered hands and kind eyes, and a middle-aged woman with the bearing of a medical professional. "Hello, Father," David said, his voice calm and measured. "I think it's time we talked." Richard stared at his son, seeing Margaret's eyes and nose, but also seeing the strength and determination of a survivor. This wasn't the frightened 8-year-old boy he'd left to die. This was a man who had not only survived, but thrived despite his father's cruelty. "David," Richard whispered, You're alive." "Yes, despite your best efforts," David replied. "This is Frank Morrison, the man who saved my life and raised me when you abandoned me. And this is Dr. Lisa Morrison, who helped me heal from the trauma you caused." Frank stepped forward, his ranger's instincts still sharp despite his age. "Richard Montgomery, you tried to murder this boy. You stole his inheritance. You mourned him publicly while counting his money privately. But worst of all, you threw away the most precious gift anyone could have, a son who loved you." Richard looked around desperately, but there was nowhere to run. Neighbors were beginning to gather, drawn by the commotion. Among them, he recognized several people from the country club, business associates, and community leaders. Dr. Lisa Morrison opened a thick folder she was carrying. "Mr. Montgomery, I've documented David's progress over the past 12 years. His autism, which you saw as a disability, has been the source of incredible gifts. He graduated high school at 15, earned his first college degree at 17, and is now working on his PhD in astrophysics." David stepped forward. "I want you to know, Father, that I forgave you years ago. Not because you deserved forgiveness, but because holding on to hatred would have poisoned me the way it poisoned you." Richard began to cry, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of self-pity and fear. "But forgiveness doesn't mean freedom from consequences," David continued. "Judge Harold Whitman, you remember him, Mom's godfather, is waiting at the courthouse with warrants for your arrest." As if summoned by David's words, police cars began arriving at the Montgomery estate. Detective Sarah Chen stepped out of the lead vehicle, holding the same manila envelope that had started this story. "Richard Montgomery, you're under arrest for attempted murder, embezzlement, fraud, and filing false police reports," Detective Chen announced. As the handcuffs clicked around Richard's wrists, David felt a hand on his shoulder. It was Catherine, his aunt, who had never stopped believing he was alive. "Your mother would be so proud," Catherine whispered, tears streaming down her face. But the story wasn't over yet. As Richard was loaded into the police car, Judge Whitman arrived with a final surprise. He carried with him a sealed envelope that Margaret Montgomery had left with him years before her death, with instructions that it only be opened in the event of something happening to David. "David," Judge Whitman said, his voice heavy with emotion, "your mother suspected that your father might not protect you. She wanted you to have this." David opened the envelope with trembling hands and found a letter in his mother's elegant handwriting. "My dearest David, if you are reading this, then something has happened and your father has failed to protect you. I want you to know that you are the most precious thing in my life, and your differences aren't flaws to be hidden. They are gifts to be celebrated. I have arranged for Judge Whitman to ensure that you will always be safe and provided for, no matter what happens. You are brilliant, you are beautiful, and you are deeply loved. Love always, Mom." Attached to the letter was a second will that Margaret had secretly prepared, naming Catherine as David's guardian and Frank Morrison as a trustee of the estate should anything happen to Richard. She had also left detailed instructions for David's care and education, showing that she had understood and planned for his needs better than anyone. The crowd that had gathered watched in amazement as this story of betrayal and redemption unfolded before their eyes. Many were crying, moved by the reunion and by David's grace in the face of such cruelty. Media outlets picked up the story within hours. "Local man reunites with son he allegedly abandoned in forest" became national news. The contrast between Richard's public image as a grieving father and the reality of his attempted filicide shocked the community. During the trial that followed, David testified with clarity and precision about his abandonment and the years that followed. His autism, which Richard had seen as a weakness, became his greatest strength in court. His perfect recall of events and his inability to lie or exaggerate made him a compelling witness. Frank Morrison testified about finding David and the decision to keep him safe while building a case against Richard. His 40 years as a forest ranger and his reputation in the community lent credibility to his account. Maria Santos, the private investigator, presented evidence of Richard's financial crimes, showing how he had systematically stolen from his son's trust fund while publicly maintaining the facade of searching for him. The prosecution's case was airtight. Richard Montgomery was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 25 years in prison. The judge, in his sentencing remarks, called it one of the most callous betrayals of parental duty he had ever encountered. David used his restored inheritance to establish the Margaret Montgomery Foundation, dedicated to supporting families with autistic children and funding research into autism spectrum disorders. He completed his PhD in astrophysics and became a renowned researcher, making groundbreaking discoveries about distant galaxies. Frank Morrison, the man who saved David's life, lived to see his surrogate son become successful and happy. David bought Frank a new cabin near the forest where they'd spent so many years together, and Frank spent his remaining years as the foundation's head of outdoor therapy programs. Dr. Lisa Morrison became the foundation's medical director, ensuring that autistic children received the support and understanding that David had been denied by his biological father. Catherine Bennett, David's aunt, served on the foundation's board and maintained her role as David's chosen family, the loving presence that helped him heal from his childhood trauma. 5 years after Richard's conviction, David met Dr. Sarah Williams, a researcher studying autism and exceptional abilities. They fell in love and married, and Sarah became a passionate advocate for autism acceptance. Together, they had 2 children, both of whom inherited David's mathematical gifts and were raised in an environment of unconditional love and acceptance. Judge Harold Whitman officiated at David's wedding, fulfilling a promise he had made to Margaret's memory to see her son happy and thriving. As for Richard Montgomery, he spent his prison years as he had spent much of his life, focused only on himself. He never acknowledged the pain he had caused or expressed genuine remorse for his actions. He died in prison in 2019, alone and unvisited, a man who had thrown away everything that mattered in pursuit of a reputation that ultimately meant nothing. On the 10-year anniversary of his rescue, David returned to Blackwood Forest with his wife and children. They visited the spot where Frank had found him, now marked with a small plaque that read, "In memory of Margaret Montgomery, who loved unconditionally, and in honor of Frank Morrison, who saved a life." David's children, ages 6 and 8, both on the autism spectrum like their father, played happily in the forest while their parents watched. They were confident, loved, and secure in the knowledge that their differences were celebrated, not hidden. "Dad," his daughter Emma asked, "why did your first dad leave you here?" David knelt down to his daughter's level, just as his mother had done for him so many years ago. "Because he didn't understand that being different is actually being special. But that's okay, because Frank found me. And now I have you and Mommy and all our family who love us just the way we are." As the sun set through the trees of Blackwood Forest, David felt his mother's presence strongly. Margaret's love had protected him even after her death, through the people she had trusted and the plans she had made. Her love had led Frank to him, had guided Catherine to never give up searching, and had ultimately brought justice to those who deserved it. The Montgomery name, once associated with wealth and social standing, became synonymous with a different kind of legacy, one of redemption, justice, and the triumph of love over cruelty. David's story inspired millions of people around the world, showing them that trauma could be overcome, that different wasn't broken, and that sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the family we're born into. And that's how justice was served, not just through the courts, but through a life lived fully, love given freely, and a man who chose to break the cycle of cruelty that could have defined him. Sometimes karma takes time, but it never misses. And in David's case, it brought him not just justice, but a life more beautiful than his father could ever have imagined. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories of justice and redemption. Because everyone deserves to know that love wins, that different is beautiful, and that no child should ever be abandoned for being exactly who they're meant to be.